I'll give you a little bit of a history of how I got to be in this role. So, I've been doing this forum for a bit. I've been with CA for about 4.5 years. I was running mainly the DevOps business unit for a while. And over the years, the conversations have been evolving, but evolving in the right direction for us. Along the way, about roughly a year and a half ago, it became apparent that this is not just a solo journey between, for our customers. It's really something where the partners need to become part of this journey as much as anybody else. We go talk to customers like yourselves. A lot of you would say, look, I work with partner A, B, C. How do you bring them into the loop? So as a part of a natural sort of progression in my sort of role within CA, I moved from what was a digital transformation and DevOps oriented function into working with partners and growing the ecosystem of our channel partners. The end objective being that all of you in this room, whether you choose to go on this journey by yourself in smaller chunks, but perhaps with a set of partners who I think are going to become relevant for you as you traverse this journey, we'll find out who I should be working with, what kinds of partners, and I'll get into that in a little bit later as to what I have discovered along the way in working with customers across the Asia Pacific region. So with that, I'm Ashok. I work across the region, India on the west. For me, I'm based in Singapore, so India is west for me. And then covering all the way up to Japan in the east and Australia and New Zealand in the south, I guess, on the southern hemisphere. So I said that the conversations, I've been coming to ITC for a while, talking to customers like yourself. Some of you are faces I've seen before, some of you are new. The conversations, 3.5, 4 years ago was like, it could be about operational efficiency, it could have been about quality, it could have been about security. But more and more, in the last year or so, what we are finding is the conversation is evolving into innovation. Okay? And it's important for us to acknowledge this shift because, it's not that quality or operational efficiency and all of those things are not important. They are fundamental to a successful and a well-oiled machine that's running in your business. But really the way forward is for companies to grow and thrive, it's about innovation. Okay? Now, anybody can talk about having an innovation engine within the organization, and sometimes in the past I myself have wondered, how do you put a process around innovation? Okay? It's not easy. But there is a structure that can be put in place. There's one aspect of it which is just capturing the idea. Tanuj showed that, just a few moments ago of how, you sort of decentralize the process of innovation. It can come from anyone. It can come from anywhere. When I talk to some of our largest accounts and customers, they're saying the innovation comes not from within but from externally. They want a process and a system and an infrastructure in place that's going to, enable the innovation cycle to be happening 24/7. Think about that. It's not a 9 to 5 occurrence. It's a 24/7 where somebody sitting in their, on their laptop, maybe on a Friday evening, in their bedroom might come up with an idea and they need to be able to go online somewhere and figure out how they're going to build a new service or an app. And by the weekend, hopefully upload it into iTunes or into Play Store. Now, what that means is there's never a shortage of ideas. The biggest problem is how do you make it come real? And that's where we've been giving it a significant amount of thought, and we said, look, we have to eliminate those barriers that come between an idea and an outcome. If we take a quick poll around this room in your particular field, I'm sure we can come up with 10 ideas in the next 10 minutes. But the challenge is going to be, I can't do it because I have a variety. And typically, those barriers are either in terms of financial constraints, or it's in terms of people, saying I don't have the right skill sets, I don't have the right people in my organization, hence the conversation around partnering and so forth, making sure you have the right obstacles or barriers that come to mind that is preventing you from taking an idea into fruition. Our mantra is there should be no barriers. Some of you might say this is a lofty goal, but during the course of this, I'll try and explain how a significant portion of these barriers can be eliminated in a systematic and a structured manner. So this is where we say what you need, a good starting point is the modern software factory. Everybody in this room has some form of a software factory running in your organization. I have no doubt about it. However, how well that software factory is performing is really the question. I'm a mechanical engineer, by the way. So, so therefore there is some correlation or some relation to what you see on the imagery. And I started my career on a factory floor, a real factory floor, making diesel engines of all things. I've studied the automotive industry, and you go back 100 years where Ford started the whole assembly process. It fundamentally changed the way manufacturing was revolutionized, right? The way people were writing and assembling an engine is really how software is being written today. The way people are coming together, putting together a car is the way software is being written today, still. We might talk about agility, but I'm here, I've seen this happen in a multiple number of customers and situations that the progression has not yet been made. It's happening, right? It's happening for two reasons. One, the technology is enabling it, but even more fundamentally, it's because the competition is making a lot of these people change the way. All the new entrants, all the cloud native, digital natives as we call them, start off with this process, right? So, a modern software factory is an integral part of removing barriers for your ideas to become true products, true outcomes. The other reality is every business is in the software business, whether we like it or not. Okay? We all know that we no longer go to a travel agent physically. We no longer go to a bank branch. We no longer even want to go to a restaurant. Given our busy lifestyles and schedules, we want to Swiggy food in. Correct? So, and I think the lifestyle changes are going to drive even more. I was talking to Piyush yesterday. They're coming up with lifestyle changes and lifestyle-related services which are going to be brokered on their platform. So everything is moving in that direction where whether I'm a consumer or whether I'm managing a large infrastructure at the back end of a data center, everything I need is going to be driven by software. So I won't belabor that point because you guys already know it. However, in the software business, the fundamental change I believe that has happened is people waking up and realizing that it's all about user experience. Okay? I mean, I did a startup, and when I did this was about 7-8 years ago. We were in that cusp. Cloud computing was just about starting to take off. The application that we were trying to launch was a cloud-based application, which was intended to be consumer-oriented, but really, with small, medium businesses and enterprise applications. So, the big realization there was that there are people who are coming up. I mean, the idea was good, but when I went and did the research, there was a lot of people who were already coming out with ideas, and similar. And the rate at which that the features were being launched was fundamentally different. But forget about the features. In fact, I used to kid myself saying, "Oh, they don't have this feature, they don't have that feature. I'm going to have all these new features." But pretty quickly, the realization dawned on me that it's really not about the features. It's not about the features, it's about the user experience. So what does that mean? What that means is the whole development process has to change on its head. It has to change on its head. Again, what does that mean? It means that the process that we typically follow is there is a marketing requirement doc called an MRD. How many of you know an MRD? What follows an MRD? Okay, after that comes the functional requirements spec. There you go. Okay, so you're well entrenched, Piyush. I'm sorry, this is not going to end well for you. But what ends up happening is the functional requirement spec is what is given to the developers. Okay, at this point, no one is even thinking about what the UI is going to look like. Nobody's even given any consideration to the end user. After all this is done, a wireframe is not even made in many cases. Okay, those of you who can recognize this process, you don't have to raise your hand, but at least you know what I'm talking about. And eventually, you get into some idea of, oh, this is what the end product might look like. At which point, by which time, it could be 10 clicks that you want, okay, to get to the feature that you want to actually get the user to use, and so forth. Then you add in security, then you add in performance, and yada, yada, yada. So let me bring closure to my personal story. Now, I talked about, coming up with an idea on a Friday evening and to be able to put it on Play Store on Saturday. Any idea how long it took me and my startup to get that idea and have the first version up and running? Again, I won't say yes or no. Any other? 5 months. 5 months. Again, it was because there were a number of barriers. Okay? And again, it was 7, 8 years ago, so I'll give myself a little bit of leeway and I won't beat myself up too badly. But really, that 5, 6 months is unacceptable. The reality is, it's got to be in days, maximum in a couple of weeks, especially for the first idea to be put together. So those are the barriers we want to eliminate. Okay? Now, in this whole user experience being everything, the trade-off is always between security and convenience. Okay? Now, I know we are all in the enterprise space. Okay? We're not talking Swiggy or we're not talking Ola, which is, by the way, those are not to be laughed at. I mean, those are all fundamental applications which are doing very, very well, or Paytm for that matter, and so forth. But the truth is, even enterprise applications have to go through this trade-off. The users will not adopt it if it's not user-friendly. Your regulatory implications are real if you don't make sure that the security aspect is taken into account, but you can't leave that for the very end. It has to be done up front. So the rest of the slides are really to go through some of those considerations that you can think about of saying, okay, these are generally the barriers we're going to face and how do we get rid of them in our cycle of development. Okay? So therefore, in steps in our blueprint for success, which is the modern software factory, and it really has 4 characteristics, broadly speaking. Okay? It has to be agile. Okay? And you can define agile however you want it, but fundamentally the idea is to say, I've got to be able to sense what the market wants, which is the end user, understand what the end user wants, and translate it into a product or a feature, or even a business model pretty quickly. When I say a business model, it could be, is it just a price change? Is it a pricing change? Is the commercial model going to be different? Is my ecosystem of other service providers, does it change? Does my equation with them change? Those are all nuances which, the idea may be great, but the way it gets delivered could be different. And therefore, the agile element of making sure that your processes are running fast is fundamental. Yesterday, Uday said it's a mindset. It is a mindset. But remember, it's not just about software. The organization has to be behind, which means marketing has to be involved, the business owner has to be involved, and the technology and the development team has to be involved. Fine. Let's say the mindset has changed, everybody's agile and they're thinking, ready to go. you will hit a barrier when you realize that your processes are not automated. Okay? So, automation is critical because it removes errors. It removes manual intervention. It reduces cost. You have to have an automation engine running through every aspect of your business. The third thing is continuous improvement. Okay? To be able to get insights from your business, right from how the end user is using your application, all the way through to saying, is it giving me the rewards? Is the business getting what it expected to get out of the outcome? Is where you've got to be able to tap in and get the data and figure out what it is. And those insights need to be fed back into the system for everything that Tanuj talked about. The self-healing, the machine learning, having the right algorithms to figure out any anomalies at an operational level all the way up to the executive level. Insights, depend based on layer in the hierarchy, the persona that is looking at the data, and to figure out what kind of decisions matter. Correct? And security, it's not an afterthought. It's got to be woven right in at every step of the way, whether you're in development or whether you're not. So these are the 4 key characteristics that we need to have in mind at all times and say, okay, is my software factory agile? Is it automated? Am I getting insights? Okay. I've been in businesses, and by the way, to this day, a lot of it is happening where people are looking at Excel spreadsheets. That's a problem. So what are the barrier breakers? I would say that there are broadly 5. Okay, there are 3 kinds of barriers. Falls into the skills, the people, technology, and financial aspects. So once you come in between the people and the technology side, I'd say there are 5 fundamental barrier breakers that you can think about. First and foremost is you're only as good as how good your plan is. Okay? And you need to be able to assimilate plans, to be able to prioritize them, build a solid business case, and to track them on a regular basis. Okay? The second part of it is, okay, you've got the right plan, you've figured out what kind of business service or a business model or a market you want to enter. The next part of this is, how is the application going to be architected? Modernizing architectures, Uday touched upon it, we'll get into it in a little bit more detail. This is a fundamental decision. If you make the right architectural decisions, the speed automatically is going to pick up. If you don't, you're going to slow down the whole process of ideas coming up into a product. After that point, automation kicks in. Whether it's development or testing or release or automated feedback loops, everything has to be automated. Next step is making sure, it's not a next step, it's really one of the another barriers which comes in where, let's say, regulatory people come in and say, oh, you can't do this because you haven't done security. You can't have your developers touch the production environment because he doesn't have credentials. You can't open up our APIs because we have not vetted it with, the Reserve Bank of India or whoever else. All these are real considerations that you've got to factor in. So the sooner you get that into your product definition, into your minimum viable product, the better off you all are. And take security into consideration from day one. Don't just start with defining the market requirement, the MRD. In that, how many times do people actually think about security? All your user requirements now take on a different language. It's about a user journey. Onboarding, the authentication, the personalization, the security aspect of it. All of those things are put in the context of a user journey. If I'm going to be coming on board to buy a product, how do I first sign up? How do I select the product? What gets presented to me, and so on and so forth. Cool. So these are the 5, and then insights we talked about. So let's start with the first one. So which company are you with? IDIC. Okay. You were a Clarity user, correct? Okay. So The fundamental difference, your question was valid. The whole idea of putting together the PPM product was to make sure that at an executive and at a resource level, you're able to make the right allocations to projects and portfolio, how many headcount we're going to be committing, how much resources to put in dollars, etc. But in a broader context, what's happening is, there is a disconnect between strategy and execution. Okay, when it comes time to actually delivering on those strategic calls, there is a disconnect and there is no linkage. So people are then off running their individual projects either in a disparate system. They might be saying, okay, listen, I've got Jira, I've got this, I've got that. And then that's disconnected from the marketing groups which are saying, okay, this is my launch schedule, this is my launch plan, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, there is no correlation. So if somebody at the executive level wants to say, this was the program I initiated and I approved, how are we doing against it? People spend perhaps 2 weeks to just gather all the data to make a presentation. Two problems with that. One is lost time, and there's no visibility. Second one is it's incorrect, because people are, in some cases, just assuming what the state of certain projects are and the connectivity and the interdependencies between projects. These are complex projects that is being undertaken. If you want a new launch, so Ola and Paytm are all planning to launch in overseas markets, for example. I think about Netflix, because they launched in 80 countries simultaneously, which is not trivial at all. Let's contrast that with IKEA. I learned yesterday that the launch of IKEA here was planned 2 years in advance. Apparently, the people were moved into IKEA into Hyderabad 2 years ago. And then you've got, that's why, brick and mortar versus the software launch process is fundamentally different, obviously. But, when you to launch simultaneously in 80 countries, you need to have an intense and, perfect understanding of all the specific market requirements. Okay? And for that, you need visibility of where each and every project team is, what the interdependencies are, what the requirements are, what the user journey in India is going to be on Netflix versus what the user journey is going to be for a Netflix user in Singapore, because the content is different. The payment gateways are different. But you've got to factor all of those things in. That's the disconnect. So what we are saying is, and that's the barrier. What we're saying is that's got to be linked to execution. So we give the platform where all your Scrum teams, if you're doing, who are running on let's say, Jira or our own platform, which is Agile Central, you've got total visibility, not only on a technology basis, but it's interconnected and linked up to your strategic plans. So this is a fundamental way to plan, prioritize, and track. When Tanuj talks about PI planning, it's really taking your strategic call for what is known as a big room planning exercise, where you're bringing in all the key stakeholders to be aligned and synchronized on priorities. Okay? Now, this is a fundamentally different way of approaching business. And then once that's happened, decisions have been made, then you let the development teams go, and then you say, okay, this is where you're going to be reporting, this is a tool you're going to be working on, and it's going to get linked back to the strategic plan. Now, you've done that. Remember, now starts the development process. Now, the development process says, what kind of product am I going to be writing, and how am I going to be writing it? It is okay if I'm going to start writing software today. What I would do is I would spin up an instance on AWS. I've got my own development environment there. A lot of the open source tools exist. I'm ready to go, right? Whatever API I want is out there, okay? And what is not out there, I'll go to, Mahindra Comviva and find the rest, right? So I'm ready to rock and roll. But this is where the second barrier comes in for you guys. You have existing systems. A lot of your core banking applications are running on mainframe systems. You've got SAP systems, you've got SFDC, you've got all the systems that Uday talked about yesterday. True or not? So what do you do with that? You cannot just wish it away. Everybody says, you know, you can't have monolithic architecture. But fact of the matter is, it's there. Fact of the matter is, oftentimes it's mission critical. And fact of the matter is, you cannot get rid of it. But what's coming new on top of that can and should be using a microservices architecture to the extent that you can. Why? It gives you speed. It gives you interoperability, but yet it keeps things loosely coupled. One can run independently of the other. So that becomes important. And then the overall environment that you're tackling has to think about, how am I going to be doing this? First question, is it waterfall? It better not be. There is no excuse to be running on waterfall anymore for new app development, because there's enough knowledge out there to go agile. How do you go do that? In my experience, you know, and I've seen this across the board, in India all the way to Japan and Korea and Australia and everywhere else in between, it really starts with a green room kind of, a greenfield kind of a model, co-located, small room, where developers come together, testers come together, ops people come together. The Scrum Master is sitting with them, and they're running on a, you know, fortnightly sort of sprint. And it's all microservices. Okay. So what is the monolithic versus the end-tier? You have to continue using whatever you can to the extent. So what are large customers doing? Are they getting rid of monolithic applications? No, they're not. But there is a conversion process where it makes sense. Certain aspects of those features and functions are being converted, and the rest is being left alone. I would suggest similar strategy be taken, should be adopted. It's because of the legacy. It's because of no CIO wants to risk his career by saying, I'm going to rip up my mainframe system or my monolithic application. If it works, don't touch it.
Gradual transition.
It's a gradual transition. Nobody wants to touch it. Because the time it has taken to get to that point has been many, many, many years, probably decades. So you can't just replicate that fast, and you don't need to. So build on it is the answer. And where? Okay. Part of my barrier was, you know, believe it or not, provisioning infrastructure. Okay. Back then, I tried everybody from, I quit Dell to start this, and I said, okay, I want to place an order. I want to get a, you know, minimum it was taking them was 1 month. In some cases, it was taking 2 months. No. Provisioning. Okay. To give me bare metal, also was taking them, it was a soft layer I spoke to, back then it was taking them 2 weeks. After I would fill out a paper, I mean, forget about it. It was just crazy. So I know I'm taking you back a few days, but the reality is, within large organizations, I'm going from a startup scenario to today's scenario. So, you know, I keep going back and forth. In the real world, what's happening is, those development teams, not every development team has the license to go swipe their credit card and open up. They have to go to the infrastructure, which is now being outsourced to some partners potentially. And those guys are still in the old world. So you've got to push your infrastructure guys to say, this is not acceptable. You've got to push your management to say, I need cloud, whether it's private or public. So dev test mostly is being done in the cloud. And then when it comes down to UAT or pre-prod or whatever, it comes back into on-prem. So, but that's, again, is the reality. You cannot escape it. Now, when you put all of this together, you have to scratch your head and say, I mean, can we remove these barriers? Happily, the answer is, it can be done. But can it be done fast? We'll get to that at the end of it. We'll ask the question, how long will it take to do this? Now, so what does the new sort of architecture look like? So you've got the microservices for some of the features that are being sent. If you're writing mobile applications now and there are bits and pieces of, let's say lifestyle services or banking transactions or ticket booking or whatever it might be, those are all written in microservices, but it's going to be reaching out into the back-end systems, all interconnected with APIs. Okay, so you've got to have an API architecture and an API strategy in place. Okay, now on the far right, what you see is the channels. The channels could be smartphone, it could be browser, it could be a phone, call center app, it could be IoT, and anything else. That's just the front end to deliver your services or content. But what's going to give you the connectivity to everything that is going to be served up along with security to say who gets to access what feature is API management. Okay? Now, the API management is not just a gateway. That's potentially the first part, which says, okay, the API gateway is a must to figure out who gets to access what. Fair enough. Okay? But you need to have a fundamental strategy in place that's going to figure out what is my entire life cycle of APIs. How am I going to catalog it? How am I going to present it? Who gets to consume it? Is it for internal consumption or am I going to publish it out in the open? Because two realities. One, if you don't have APIs, you need to have APIs. If you don't have APIs, you're dead. Right? Your history, in 5 years, you'll be dead if you don't have APIs that are opening up to the public world. Because why? Because if you don't, you're not going to be commercially viable. You're not going to be participating in what is known as, in the old world, used to be called e-commerce. I read Google published, or I think it was Bain Consulting, there are 390 million users of the internet in India now, active users. 390 million, which is more than the population of the US. And it'll only grow. So which means, with everything else that Sunil talked about yesterday, NLP, artificial intelligence, voice recognition, language translation features, etc., everybody is going to be able to extract services via the internet. And then you put the India stack on top of it, there are going to be services delivered to everybody, regardless of social class or the so-called digital divide. I don't believe that there is going to be a digital divide. There will not be. So, what that means is you've got to have an API strategy in place. Okay, if you don't, that's another barrier. Meaning, simple thing, what are the APIs that I'm going to be serving up? Am I, first of all, going to have an external face to the world? The answer is yes, has to be yes, I hope by now. Then the question is, for what purpose? Okay, let's take you back to 1999, assuming you were, in the technology space at that time. That's when the first version of the web came on. Everybody said, I need to have a portal. Okay? Everybody had a portal, but the first part of all these portals was just sharing information. So if I went up to a bank website, I would know where the branches were or where the ATMs was. That was the extent of it. That's your part of your first strategy. What am I going to serve up? At least let me be present. When somebody pulls, my API, I'm serving a certain set of services. Then it starts to say, okay, what else can I open up? Can I serve data regarding my customers? Whether it is open, whether or not, whether I've got the permission or not. Now, transaction services, commerce-related services, balance checking, fund transfer, all of those things become services. All those features and functionality, data and logic that's sitting inside behind your firewall strategy is, what am I going to open up? What am I going to publish? The example I'd like to give is a very, very, straightforward example, which is, you get, you've heard of Alexa. A lot of you probably use OK Google and so forth. The so-called digital assistant is nothing more than a bunch of APIs who's going to go do work for you. If City is not online, so here's the example. I want to get on my phone and I say, OK Google. I realize, that it's, let's say, my mother's or my wife's birthday, and I'm traveling. So I say, OK Google, send flowers to my mother. That's all I want to say. Nothing else. Now, the phone has it. So it's all driven by APIs or my contact list. The data is published. Now, where is the flowers going to come from? It's going to go search. And if a flower shop does not have APIs, that guy's out of the consideration. You see? But if he is in the system, then it's going to say, oh, who's the nearest? Then a logistics company comes into play. Then the bank comes into play, because ultimately, these are the people who are going to help in the settlement. Now, that's a simple example of saying how everybody needs to have some form of APIs. Now, if I want to send a, and these examples can go on and on and on. I mean, you can make up as many as you want. And this is where, somebody who's sitting in the bed on a Friday night says, geez, I wish I could do this and create his app, gifting app dot whatever, Ashok, to put, I need to be able to do it. And I will go, all I'm going to do is search for APIs and say who all have it published, and they are part of my system, you see. So I cannot be holding back people and saying, oh, I've got to vet this payment gateway and figure out. Correct. Exactly. Ecosystem. So what that's going to do is it's going to change, it's going to disrupt enormously. Business models are going to be changing. Now, restaurants have probably put their API.
And understand what API is going to do that, because we have the use cases. Like he was giving the example, until unless he don't go and explain to the business, he just know the problem. But how it is to be done, until and unless that acceptance is come to the business, they are not going to buy and invest on the infrastructure and the ecosystem.
Which then comes to the whole point of our organizations. Today, there are people who hold the title of Chief Digital Officer. Chief Digital Officer is really you can define his job description any which way, but really, to take a business idea and to make it into reality through digital media is really the crux of it. Okay. Today, if you ask business owners, they'll say, I've got enough ideas, it's IT that's not really delivering for me. Right? You've heard that before, right? So that's the strategy one needs. That's the conversation one needs to have. Waterfall process, what has happened is, the way the development process goes is a good amount of time is spent actually documenting the requirements. Then it goes into development. Documentation is necessary. So we'll get into the, there are best practices, which is really, if you take the agile process, there's this notion of a user journey. The user journey translates into a user story. The user story automatically, and we'll get into that, you're taking me actually into the next page, which is, now how do we'll get to that. Let me go through this and you can tell me. So, let's say I'm in an agile team now. Let's say this is an agile team and this is an agile team working on two different sets of functionality. How many of you are die-hard fans of Jira? You're a die-hard fan of Jira. Okay. Everybody? Okay. So you all have not considered Agile Central. Okay. Doesn't matter. From Jira, what do? People are managing, figuring out what their tasks are and what issues are. It's a bug tracking and these are the bugs and so on and so forth. Fine. Now, what this team that is managing all this is needing, then they've got their tools. They've got their Git, they've got Maven, they've got Jenkins. They think, I've developed my code and I put it in there, I'm ready to rock and roll. Reality is, now this is where our monolithic systems come into play. Lack of data comes into play. Okay, lack of proper documentation comes into play. Okay, so I've got an agile team which is running every 2 sprint. I'm supposed to launch something or release something in 2 days, in 2 weeks, and I have barriers. Then we say you've got to be able to auto-generate test cases. How do you do that? You link it back to the user story, okay? And that user story has got to be linked back to the strategy which you agreed, the PI planning process. All of these processes don't exist. In a waterfall method, you're agreeing to having a finished product getting launched in, let's say, 6 months or 12 months. I've worked for software companies for a number of years, but what we've always said, I need to come up with a release every 12 months. Sometimes 18 months. That's not going to work. That's what Agile gets you out of. Because, it's part philosophy, part methodology. The point is, unless you put the product out in the open domain and people use it, you don't know what is really working and what is not. At least with your users, at least with the focus group that you bring in, they need to be giving you feedback. Okay, that's why we distinguish. The waterfall methodology is okay when you're writing a serious amount of code, or the whole team coming together, writing one monolithic block of code with millions of lines of features and functions and so forth. But Agile is saying, okay, let's write bits and pieces. It requires extreme discipline to say, I will not launch this feature. That's why the concept of a minimum viable product, which puts a lot of emphasis on the business analyst and the marketing team or the product teams to be very clear about what they want to launch. Now, you take modern day applications, even things like WhatsApp, for the first few, they did very fundamental things. They didn't have groups in the beginning. They didn't have any of those things. Now, coming back to my startup journey, when I fell prey, and I'm being honest about it. I thought my way to, becoming Mark Zuckerberg was to, overload features. That's changed because the thinking is now changed fundamentally to say, what's the user journey going to be like? And when you wow the user with convenience, saying, he never had this in the first place. That's number one. Number two, you say, okay, can I wow him with, an omni-channel experience? What does that mean? You go to YouTube or any of these features, if you're watching a particular program on your mobile, you stop and then you go back home and you want to log in, it picks up from exactly where you left off. That's an omni-channel experience. How many of your banking applications can do that, where you start a process on your mobile phone and then pick it up and say, oh, I didn't complete the transaction, let me do it on my browser? Cannot. So my point is, those kinds of user stories, those kinds of user journeys have to be documented, and the documentation should not be too far away from actually saying, okay, this is what it's going to translate into code. See, so there you're bringing much tighter integration between the time a requirement is defined to the time the code is actually being written and tested. The test case, the first part over there is auto-generate test cases. Because now what's happening is, more barriers are coming in. Oh, it's going to take me a long time to test this. Okay? Or I'm going to write code. I'll spare 2 days at the end of, the day 13 and day 14 will be for testing. How many of you do that? Cannot. A lot of this testing has to be happening up front. It's the whole shift left paradigm. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. Correct? That can only happen if test cases, and the right test cases get generated. So today, the translation from a business analyst to a developer to a tester, it's actually, a 3-step process. The test cases are actually being generated, imagined by the testing engineers who are interpreting what it should be doing. Perfect. Perfect. You cannot ignore the test cases. That's the takeaway, and to do it up front. But that should also give you insight to say, and now this is more from, quality perspective, it is from a compliance perspective to say, what is the coverage? Did I cover all my use cases? Functionality? Again, from the minimum viable product. Now that's where you've got to have that capability. We give that in what is a product called ARD, Agile Requirements Designer. Then the next barrier is, I don't have access to my backend systems. Okay, production won't give me, they won't give me test data because these are all production data. Where do I go get it? By the time these kinds of environments are even made available, I have two choices. One, give up my idea, or I'm sitting and mocking this stuff up. Okay, so now all of a sudden the productivity of your sprint has gone down dramatically. Somebody is sitting and mocking what kind of the backend system is supposed to behave like, which is a barrier. You can't do that. Which is where service virtualization comes into play, where some of the, we've got some pretty neat ways of recording the traffic between systems. When you put in a particular kind of call, regardless of protocol, most kinds of protocols we cover, we make sense of it. We can put a recorder in between, which is listener, or we take a look at the logs and we're able to figure out. You can call it artificial intelligence, you need not, it's pattern recognition, whatever it is. But that's the intelligence that quickly says, okay, these are how am I doing for time? Done. Are you kidding me? It's all their fault, Okay, so let me hurry through it. Give me 10 more minutes, Amit. Give me 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, I'll take 7. Test data performance testing. So you got to do all that up front in the cycle. Now, those of you who are committed to saying, I've got my Jenkins, I've got my open source infrastructure, keep it. We're not asking you to get rid of it. But so that's basic requirement. You need a place to store your source code and your binaries and so forth. But this is where you supercharge the productivity of the team by giving them access to stuff that they did not knew existed, and therefore the feature gets released faster. Okay? Here is where you do code scanning. You scan through the code to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities. Okay? That's our product called Veracode. And right up front, at the time of people writing code, you're now able to capture any potential vulnerabilities, either in static mode or in real mode. Okay? And now you feed it back. Now you're able to give more real-life feedback to your central Agile Central team, which is taking in feedback. Now, this is integrated either to Jira or to Agile Central, depending on how you want to do it. But just having Jira, Git, and all your CI/CD tools is not sufficient. That's the takeaway from here. You'll still have barriers. Okay? So, moving on. Barrier breaker number 4 is security. In the old world, it was perimeter security. As long as I had my network firewall, I felt I was safe. But it's really about user privileges, access, and really application and data prevention, protection. So who gets to access what becomes very important. It's also a regulatory requirement to say, how do you know the person who checked in code did not mess with it? Or how do you know that the person who's authorized to do it was the only one who did it? So you need to have this for audit purposes. And so that level of, if you automate it and make sure that all these security parameters are factored in, it's another barrier that is being removed. What you want when it comes time to figuring out root cause analysis, if an application is performing poorly, if it's crashing, if it is looping on a page, you need to know what the root cause of the problem is. Is it your infrastructure? Is it your application? Is it your device? Is it your network? Is it your carrier? What have you? That's where that analytics engine that you see there is what Tanuj was referring to as Jarvis. So that's the data lake which has the mechanism for you to embed your AI algorithms, which are then going to say, we move from sort of a diagnostic capability, which is basically RCA, to predictive, to saying this is what will happen, to then prescriptive, saying this is what needs to be done to fix it. Okay, so the self-healing algorithms start to kick in, and the things that are feeding into this analytics engine are data from all these various sources that are coming in. whether it's wearables, email, apps, APIs, IoT. So this is at the very end, the channel that's consuming or using the software. These are the applications that are running. And this is the infrastructure, whether it's on a Docker or whether it's on a mainframe, all of this is feeding into your data lake. And this is where the diagnostics and the prescriptive nature of these solutions start to get served up in what is known as the digital experience insights. So the question is Jarvis something like APM? No. Jarvis is actually an internal project code name, which was really our single repository, was a data lake plus the AI engine to process and give the analytics capability for inputs from, this is what is known as AXA. Those of you who've heard of AXA. This is the application user analytics. This is APM, your Dynatrace sort of competition. And this is our traditional UIM, which is the infrastructure. So those of you who are talking about Dynatrace, that's one piece. It doesn't give you the end-to-end picture. What you do need is an end-to-end view, or at least your strategy needs to have this end-to-end visibility. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to give the answer that people are looking for. There are agentless also. There are probless also. We've got a number of, and you'll be hearing a whole new section on this. Amit will beat me up if we start getting into the deep dive of this. But there is a separate section on this, so please hold that thought. These are our self-promotional pat on the back kind of slides. So, but the key takeaway here is this, folks. You're working with best-in-class technology over here. This really is the number one or number two in the particular market. And analysts, without fail, Gartner, Forrester, everybody has called us and put us in the leaders quadrant or in the magic quadrant. Okay, so this has been a systematic way in which we've been building our strategy as a company. And it's not just us who are putting it together. I've seen it in a number of places across the region. We've seen it internally within CA. So I can stand here and quite confidently say that you're on the right track, learning possibly the right things, and now it's a matter of putting it into practice. The only other message I would give you is, don't expect miracles. This doesn't happen overnight. Somebody yesterday asked the question, how long it took CA? It took 2 years, according to Uday, from a GIS perspective. From some of the bigger banks, etc., it's taken them 4 or 5 years. But then, a lot of learning has been productized. It's ready for consumption, so there should be much faster journey for you guys. So with that, I thank you very much.